What's up, everybody? Welcome to a new video series joint with Bloody Elbow and MMA Payout. I'm Paul Gift, and we've got on the line with us Jason Cruz and John Nash. You know him as Not the Face. This is going to be a regular series about sort of business and legal issues in mixed martial arts. And we don't really have a schedule. We're just going to come and talk to you whenever big news arises. And the schedule today, though, on tap today, is to revisit 2014. The business legal issues of 2014 that we think are interesting. That's kind of where we're going to go today. Let's start by introducing you to the other two people with me. If you want to go ahead and say a little bit about yourselves, and then we'll go ahead and get started. People probably already know both of you, but might as well do it anyway.
Okay, I'll go first, I guess. I'm John Nash. I freelance write mostly for Bloody Elbow. My Twitter handle is at HeyNotTheFace. I probably already screwed up this podcast stepping on your intro line to ask you're there, so you know how professional we are here as we go along. And I'm probably the least qualified to be speaking business or legal, but I'm here. Anyways, Jason, your intro.
Hey, wait, real quick, John. What's up with Hey Not the Face, just so that everybody knows?
Hey, not the face. It's my battle cry. You know, hey, not the face. Please, not the face. Yeah, that's my. You know,
I like it.
I'm pretty honest about my boxing skills. Let's put it that way.
Sounds good. So the crotch is okay, just not the face.
Yeah, well, yeah. You know, nothing. I gotta protect the moneymaker.
All right.
You got this. You guys got something like that. You gotta protect it.
Jason, take it away.
Okay, yeah. So I'm Jason Cruz. I'm a writer for MMAPayout.com. Also, I guess you could say an attorney out on the side, and I'm up here in Seattle, Washington.
All right, and I'm Paul Gift. I'm an economics professor at Pepperdine, and I've been doing MMA analytics for a few years now, and at Bloody Elbow for 1 year. And so the topic list today, so normally when big news comes out, it'll probably just be that one major thing. Buster, stop. It's my dog going crazy. It'll probably just be that one major thing that we'll be talking about. But for today, we've got a list of 5 possible topics, although we'll make sure that we don't make this go too long. So we'll start with the ones we think are most important and then sort of move on down. We've got the UFC lawsuit to talk about, the Reebok deal and uniform rules. We've got the new Bellator MMA, the idea of independent contractors for fighters versus employees, and the pay-per-view numbers over the last year or more, along with some of John's stuff on UFC financials. So go ahead and get started with the UFC lawsuit. Quick review on that for those who aren't too terribly familiar with it. A group of fighters sued the UFC in December for essentially is that they're claiming that the UFC has monopoly power in the output market when they sell entertainment and they sell ad licenses or they sell ad space, they sell content licenses, and monopsony in the input market for fighter labor services. The claim is that they have power there and they have anti-competitively maintained and enhanced that power over a number of years through restrictions on fighters, specifically with exclusive contracts for fighter services. And the idea is that you lock those fighters up with exclusives and you make it harder for competing rival promotions to fighter services, resulting in wages going down. That's essentially that deal in a nutshell. So let me toss it out to you guys. First question is, what elements of this case, I assume both of you have read the complaint. That would not be good if you haven't. What elements do you find most interesting? When you read it, what elements of this case stood out to you? You said, wow, I'm interested in that because this.
Should I go first, or Jace, you want to go first?
Okay. Go ahead, John.
Okay. I mean, I first heard about it months ago, so it's hard for me from the complaint to say what interested me in the complaint, but stood out. I guess the thing that got me is I've spoken to a lot of people that are, you know, class action attorneys and professors of antitrust, and all of them were really impressed with the complaint, which is kind of funny because most fans kind of laugh it off. They look at these little quotes from Dana White and they laugh it off and say it's not that important, it's a ridiculous lawsuit. And I think what's got me is I think people are missing that the complaint objective really is just to get beyond the dismissal phase. And if they can get past dismissal phase, that's when it becomes a real suit. So what impressed me was how much they got, basically the UFC claiming to be in a monopoly, being the NFL of the league and having no competition, basically doing the work for them just to get past that dismissal phase. Jason?
You know, I think one of the things that is interesting going forward into 2015, and let's face it, folks, this thing's not going to end in 2015. It might not end in 2016. I think the one issue, the issues that you have procedurally are compelling from a lawyer's standpoint. I mean, the Zuffa, you could have seen this coming with just one, Kung Lee being the one a resident of San Jose, that Zuffa would try to transfer this out to Nevada, and that's actually occurring. I mean, obviously there are some compelling points on both sides, and the fact of the matter is they got a hearing set for May 7th. The Zuffa lawyers want this to happen in March, basically advancing the hearing date to transfer the venue. Even so far as to say, hey, Judge, we don't need a hearing date or oral argument. In their papers, they say, hey, we just, here's the law, and you could make the decision, transfer it to Las Vegas. So, I mean, it's going to be a compelling from the procedural standpoint from that point. Even with notwithstanding that transfer, you still have an impending motion to dismiss it. I assume everybody thinks and knows is going to try to happen. Whether or not they're successful is going to be an interesting component of that. And that doesn't even get to the substantive part of the complaint.
Yeah, the interesting thing to me, and I agree with you, John, that surviving motions to dismiss extremely important, and also then the class certification as well. If they don't get class certification, it's probably dead in the water. But the interesting thing to me when I read it, as someone who had worked on these cases before, just like this, literally just like this with exclusive contracts, was that you saw it coming from the fighters, whereas normally, and it's not that that can't happen, it's just rare. That element is rare. Usually when you see this foreclosing a critical input from rival competitors to try to put them at a competitive disadvantage, when you see those stories, the people bringing the lawsuits are the competitors themselves. So that was the thing that first stood out to me as just interesting, something that you don't quite see every day, and you don't get as many monopsony antitrust lawsuits out there. So this is a little bit more unusual in that regard.
Yeah. No. Yeah. I think. I mean, I guess the big thing is that it's a sport, and because it's a sport, you know, how many other major sports are there that could really only in a sports situation I think you're going to see many monopsony charges, because it's. I mean, you know better than me, Paul. You're the economics whiz, but there's always options for people in almost any other industry. Sports a little different, in my head at least.
I think the one other correlation you can bring to it that maybe some people might know of is Amazon.com and the publishing company Hackett. They're having that big dispute, I guess late last year, in which there was some compelling interest with respect to how is Hackett being foreseen on the Amazon.com webpage. That's kind of the only other monopsony that I could kind of think up in my head. So.
Yeah, they're very rare, and then because it's sports, that's the one reason sort of everyone should be really skeptical. And this I mean about the sport organization itself, the UFC, because professional sports has a history of screwing people over, a long history of screwing people over. So, all right, so you've gone through the complaint. The two questions coming up are what aspects of the complaint do you think are particularly strong, and what aspects do you think are particularly weak? And I don't know if maybe we want to think about during dismissal phase or class cert, but I just sort of mean in general. If the case progresses what elements do you see as being particularly strong? What elements particularly weak?
I guess for me, it's gonna. I mean, a lot's gonna be when they get into when they get in disclosure phase and they get actually investigation. What's gonna be strong? But for me, the weakest part's the monopoly charge, because there's always, as much as the UFC might have own 90% of the MMA market. There's you can always say there's other entertainment avenues. There's other there's boxing, there's kickboxing, there's all these other things they're competing with. So it's hard for me to say that they have a monopoly on a product that people choose to watch. The stuff about to me the most interesting, I think maybe the strongest case is going to be when they bring up the systematic way, the scheme basically, as they argue, the systematic way that the UFC has captured the monopsony market over the MMA fighters, which I think will get more interesting as it goes along, because I think at first a lot of fans are just going to write it off and say, and this is not to say the UFC is guilty, but I think people are writing it off, oh, they signed the contract, and people forget, when a charge of monopsony is, yeah, people with free will sign those contracts. But signing a contract doesn't mean much if that's the only contract available, because the market's been skewed. And so that's where I think it's going to get really interesting, and that's the part, I will gleefully look forward to in the future that they discuss if it goes ahead.
Jason, what do you think?
I agree with John with the monopoly issue. I think there's other the UFC can definitely argue away the issues regarding the monopoly power, and basically, I foresee them arguing that they just through their own hard work and guile, they've got to where they've become in the marketplace. But as far as something interesting of note would be the video game issue, specifically with John Fitch. I mean, I think if it gets to that particular phase, his deposition will be very interesting as far as what went down with the whole issue of when he was temporarily fired, I guess you could say, because he would not sign away his rights, sign away his likenesses rights.
Right. Yeah. And I agree with both of you that the monopoly charge or monopolization charge is the weakest. And the thing I wrote about it, I honestly didn't even know why they included it, except that it's almost costless to do so. Do you guys have any?
Okay, so I couldn't hear you there for just a second.
Yeah, you cut out.
Yeah, conveniently. So we all agree the monopolization charge. What do you think it's doing there?
Well, you dropped it. I'm going to just guess what you said because I'm a lip reader. But yes, we agree. I believe the monopoly charge is going to be hard to prove. Monopsony is going to be the one that's going to be much more interesting, and the idea of the scheme that the UFC intentionally came up with a game plan to capture this market and retain fighters and prevent competitors from popping up. I think that's the part. We'll have to wait and see, though. I mean, who knows? It might not get past dismissal, but from everyone I've spoken to that are familiar with these type of things, they think this getting past dismissal, they have a strong enough case to get past it. They give it very good odds at that point, and so we should look forward to disclosure.
That would definitely be interesting. I want to see the leaked Dana White deposition so bad.
Yeah, I mean, what people tell me, there's a lot of interesting stuff that might come up, but there might not. Who knows? It might be the most boring disclosure. Might be a huge disappointment for everybody. So.
Right, and where you think they're the weakest? Some of you already, like John, you might have already touched on this a little bit, but where do you think, Jason, I don't think you did, where do you think they're the weakest?
Well, one of the things that interested me is how many fighters will join this lawsuit. I think, what are we at, 8, 10 right now? But I'm interested to see the level of fighter that does join the lawsuit, and then whether or not it gets certified. I assume that based on the amount of attorneys in the pot, that they know that they can get the people. So
yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm an idiot. I said where do you think they're the weakest, and obviously we were talking about monopoly already. I meant where do you think they're the strongest? Right. So. Probably weakest on the monopoly aspect because there's so many other things people can do with their money. One other area I personally think that they're weak in is that venue exclusion argument. The idea that you're using these exclusive contracts to keep other venues away from rival MMA promotions. I mean, because I've lived something like that, almost the exact same thing. It was a company that was using exclusive contracts with retailers in Cincinnati, and the competitor was saying, "You've got all the retailers in Cincinnati, make it stop," right? And it turns out that they just sort of had the best one in each category, and there were a ton of other retailers available. So I've sort of seen that one in action, and I think that one's particularly weak.
What I'm interested, I guess what I'm interested in, you guys might know something about this, what I'm interested in is the idea, and this is something I heard from the plaintiffs which was great when I was there when they filed, and everybody left, and I ended up at the bar with everybody, with the fighters and the lawyers, all by myself. But what I'm interested in is they're arguing some sort of scheme, and Carlos Newton was telling me, pay attention to the system. He kept telling me, pay attention to the system. And I'm wondering how, since you guys are much more familiar with economics and law, I guess, is how are they going to talk about, I guess, like they're talking about individual pieces might not be illegal, but they're talking about how they overlap with one another to give them this control over the system. And I'm just wondering how they're going to argue that, and if that's going to come up in the court, how that's going to be presented.
Yeah, I mean, my answer would be that at the end of the day, this type of determination is a binary type of determination. There are a bunch of pieces of the puzzle, and there might not be one piece that overwhelms, but at the end of the day, you kind of end up with a yes/no. Do you have monopoly power or not, and have you been enhancing it? But there's one crux of their case. That's the exclusive contracts with the fighters. Then there are sort of more, instead of the overall system, I would call it the sort of exacerbating factors, right? Then you throw in the sponsorship stuff. Then you throw in the venue arrangements. Then there's one other I feel like I'm forgetting about. So I don't quite look at it as an overall system as opposed to one major allegation and a few exacerbating factors that are quite common when you see these types of cases. I don't know, Jason, any thoughts?
Yeah, and basically, if they can get all of that information into evidence, they can wrap it up and tie it in a bow and present it. And I think that's kind of what perhaps that's tying in all of the schemes and individual schemes, and basically compiling it up to present it as evidence. And perhaps that's where you get all these little pieces in a puzzle to make that picture. So I think that's what they're talking about.
So were any of you guys surprised by their relevant markets, or were they exactly what you thought they would be? You know, the elite professional MMA fighters, that sort of thing?
No, I wasn't. I mean, I guess, what are you going to classify fighters in the UFC? You know, it reminded me, like I've talked to you before about this, it reminds me a little bit of the International Boxing Club of New York versus the United States versus the International Boxing Club of New York, where they classified as championship boxing. You know, so it reminds me a little bit of that. I think eventually, though, just speaking to people who do antitrust lawyers and professors, just my gut feeling is they're going to have to classify it, maybe narrow it a little more, maybe to people that have re-signed with the UFC, because the UFC's monopoly power would much more, if they argue and win that they have monopoly power, the argument in the restrictive contracts, you'd have to be under one of those contracts to be restricted. So my guess is maybe they'll try to limit to people that have signed with the UFC and then had an option to renegotiate, and they couldn't get their full worth. That'll be the class. In other words, I don't know. What do I know?
No, I think you're pretty much on point there, John. I think that kind of is why they at this point had a narrow mark by adding elite to the particular class. Otherwise, it would be just too overbroad to just say all these MMA fighters.
Yeah, but their definition of elite, I thought, was pretty broad. That they had pretty much, if you're in the UFC, you're elite, and then what if you've got what was it, notoriety, or have done, I don't remember how they worded it. Oh wait, I have it right in front of me. Develop significant public notoriety amongst MMA industry, media, and the consuming audience through demonstrated success in athletic competition, and then this local and/or regional promotion thing. So that shocked me a little bit that was in there.
I don't the notoriety. I mean, the idea that anybody in the UFC maybe, but I don't. The trying to narrow it to famous, popular, uh, fighters makes sense to me. But I mean, how do you classify, I guess, champion boxers without a belt? I mean, if they don't have the title, would you say a club boxer is the same as Amir Khan?
Right,
Yeah.
but
So,
I mean, the key here is that this is critically important, right? What they do here is so incredibly important because if they don't get monopoly power or monopsony power to start with, they're
yeah,
screwed. Their whole case is over.
yeah,
So this definition could not be more important, and then I wonder if it's just sort of a introductory sort of somewhat generic definition, and once the expert witnesses come in and take over, that we'll see that changing. Those are my thoughts.
yeah. That's from what others have told me. I kind of expect that to happen too. That was their expectation. So I'm going to go with them. They know more than me, so I'm going to ride their coattails.
All right. So what do you think? What about the Fighter Endgame? In other words, what I mean by that is we've got fighter public statements, but why do you think they're doing this? Forget about what people say in public. Why do you think the fighters are doing it, and what do you think they realistically should hope to get out of it?
Haven't spoken to a bunch of them, and the people involved. I mean, some of them are true believers. I mean, the lawyer that brought the whole case together, Rob Macy, he's a true believer. He's friends with some of these guys. Carlos Newton, he's the guy that came up with the idea, and I don't think maybe he's expecting to get some money, but there's a good chance he might because he's not even attached to the suit. He might not even be eligible. So he's a true believer. This is, something that he wants to lay down as kind of a legacy. Some of them are just, they told me they want the money, and others are, I think the final result is they want a lot of them expect a lot of money or hope a lot of money out of it, and some of them hope a change in the industry. And that's the two. There's some overlap. Some guys want money, some want to change the industry, and a lot of them overlap. I think that's the group.
I think just like with any lawsuit and litigation, when people file lawsuits and things like that, there's a component of altruism. Like people want to right the system and make sure that the people following them have a fair playing field. And then obviously there's the money component. It's clear that fighters for the longest times have had a depressed market, and this lawsuit should be able to pan out whether or not they can get a fair shake, or as far as the fighters believe. So, I'm sure there's a fair share of people who have these differing views of why they're doing this.
All right, and let's put us on the spot. Let's put us on the spot with our predictions. We have to predict today. Our life is on the line. The most likely outcome of this case. I won't make you guys go first. I'll go first. God, why do I go first?
You said so.
Because I'm honestly not sure that it makes it past some of these initial phases. But if you had to make me guess, I think it probably would. But my whole deal is that the problem is that these guys are fighting against. They're not fighting against price fixing, which when you can show that that's going on, it's very easy to win. They're fighting against this rule of reason, which makes it super hard to go to court and win when there's any remotely sort of pro-competitive justification for what the companies are doing. So if I had to guess today, I'm going to say it makes it past motion to dismiss. God, I'm really not sure about class certification. I'm not as much of an expert on class certification issues, so I'll just say yes, hopefully, or maybe. But I see settlement either before summary judgment or after summary judgment. I guess depends on your leverage is going to depend on who comes out ahead in summary judgment. But it could be settlement before that, settlement after, but settlement somewhere. A little bit of money for fighters and maybe some small changes, but I've just seen so many settlements disappoint in antitrust cases. When you look at them and you're just like, what kind of settlement is that? it seems ridiculous. Anyway, that's my grand prediction. What do you guys think?
I think that's. I mean, mine is based on. I'll have to go with some people who know this are more experts than I am, but I think the big thing is if they do not get a change of venue, which about probably a 50-50 chance that it goes to Nevada or stays in San Jose, if it stays in Northern California, gets past dismissal, which seems likely, then I'm guessing it's going to go to settlement. I think if it stays in Northern California, UFC is going to get a little more nervous going into discovery phase because it's in a very antitrust-friendly location, and they'll be looking at discovery. I'm guessing there's probably some stuff in discovery they don't want revealed, so they'll make some phone calls, and the lawyers will decide and say, hey, let's just take the $100 million. We'll take a large sum. That'll seem large to people, but when you divide it by everybody involved and how much money really could be at stake, I don't think that's that large. That's a very affordable settlement for the UFC.
I think that I will go out on a limb here and say that it will go to Nevada. It'll be transferred to Nevada, and but it won't. It will survive dismissal, and so it will settle. And what I would be I don't know how much it will be settled for, but definitely the parties won't want to take this to a trial, even though it will be transferred. What will be interesting to me to see is whether or not Zuffa does anything after this to accommodate its fighters. Whether or not, or do they just say, hey, we settled this antitrust lawsuit, don't complain anymore. So we'll see what happens after that. But so that's kind of what I think. Like you guys, I definitely think this case is not going to trial, and we settle before anything substantive discovery-wise occurs.
Yeah, if it goes to trial, though, man, that's a lot of money. A lot of money is going to be on the.
Yeah.
The decision-making factor right there.
And one of the things that also you guys have brought up about the subpoenas to YouTube and Twitter, I mean, that also brings in attorneys for YouTube and Twitter questioning the subpoenas and how much they want to divulge in their own, as far as their own business records go, and how much they wanted to participate, be an unwilling participant in this particular lawsuit. So it'll be interesting to see that as well.
Right. Yeah. I don't know as much about transfer of venue to take a position on it. I would get cases after all that stuff was done. The one thing I'm gonna disagree with John on, thinking 20 or less, but we'll see.
I wanted the large number just if they get past. I'm not saying they're, but only if they get past missile and it stays in Northern California.
Yeah.
And their stuff that there's stuff in discovery that might come out, and then they go, damn it, we don't want that out. That was my guess.
Oh, but if they really don't want stuff out, yeah.
Yeah, that's my. But again, it could, there's so many variables. Who knows? There, if it stays in, it goes to Nevada, and then the price drops. I think on settlement, the plaintiffs are going to want to settle faster.
The way you see a really big settlement is if this thing goes all the way to summary judgment and the fighters get a couple rulings. The whole case would probably not be decided right, but a couple aspects decided in the fighters' favor that puts them in a hugely dominant position going into trial. That in my opinion, is where you see a major settlement. Yeah. Where the risk is going to trial and there's only a couple things that the trial is going to be about, and if you lose a ton of money. Then we might see a lot going to the fighters. Well,
I mean, eventually, if it goes to trial and the fighters win across the board, let's say, we're talking, treble damages. If you compare it to boxing or other major sports, you're probably talking, $500 million in damages. Treble would be $1.5 billion. So if you get that far, then there will be no settlement at that point, because I think the fighters will blow off any sort of settlement. The lawyers, they'll be looking at that huge, but that's just almost that's dreaming, I would imagine at this point.
That would be the grand slam for that.
That would be the grand. We'd have a lot to write about.
Yeah.
A lot to write about at that point.
Yeah, selfishly, I'd like to see it happen.
At least we have subject matter, right? We have nothing. If we're out of ideas, just go back to that. That'd be great.
This is the only time we're going to get actual MMA people caring about antitrust. Got to milk this for all it's worth.
Oh, I'm going to dread dismissal if it gets dismissed. Well, you know.
There could be appeal. There could be an appeal, always.
Yes.
So, you know, the one area where and getting a judge who's essentially saying, wait a second, you're telling me that you have a problem with LeBron James having an exclusive contract because he can't go play basketball for the whatever USBL, is that still a thing? I don't remember. In the summer, right? And getting some judge to say this is ridiculous. It's not beyond the realm of possibility to me, but I don't think it's particularly likely. But from a certain perspective, when people look at this as an organization and say, why would they want their people working for someone else? It's not beyond the realm of possibility that something happens like that with dismissal. Hey, that's just my thought.
No, I agree. I think I think they're going to argue the restrictive clauses and all that stuff. I have no clue. I think the restrictive clause is going to be their argument more than the exclusive.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Anything else you want to add here? Are we moving on?
We should probably should move on considering our time.
Yeah, maybe I should be keeping track of time too, huh?
Yeah.
All right, guys, let's go ahead with the Reebok deal. And John, take it away.
Well, actually, I thought we were going to go to Bellator first.
Yeah.
Oh, whatever you want to do.
Oh, that's fine. I'll do Bellator first, and then we'll go on to the other subjects. Well, as everybody knows, over the summer, Bellator got a new head, which is Scott Coker, and they've gone in a whole new direction, which is getting rid of the tournament format and moving on to much more of a Strikeforce 2.1, or Spike Force, as some people call it, format of bigger shows. They just had their November 15th. They presented their new look for Bellator, which are bigger production value, once-a-month shows, and basically going, I think it seems to me, going back to that MMA method of sport and spectacle meshed together. So that's where we are. I guess the first thing is, I would ask is, Jason, I guess your opinion, if you could tell, what was the opinion of Bellator before Scott Coker took over?
Well, you know, it wasn't that much, and if you could just base it on the ratings and the seasons, and you know what Bjorn Rebney attempted to do, and you know he was turning around the product. I would say, but I think that there was a lot to want with those tournaments, and it just was not satisfying what people's interests were. And definitely when Coker took over, you definitely saw his philosophy and his way of thinking, and it seemed as though that with the higher production values and the signings of Ortiz and Bonner and Rampage, that at the time anyway, that he's turned it around, and he's put together a product that people are willing to look at and watch. And I guess the less is more philosophy seems to work. Whereas Bellator under Rebney, you know, the product each week didn't seem as crisp or as interesting as it does now.
Okay. Now, my big thing was, I know a lot of Bellator was really unpopular with a lot of fighters and managers because they're old contracts, and everybody seems a lot happier with it. So, Paul, I guess my question for you would be, what do you think Scott has to do to be successful? How would you measure success for him in Bellator?
How would I measure success for him in Bellator? First, I would figure out where we're starting from, right? And do you guys know? I don't think I was actually looking through the Viacom 10K before this thing to try to see if there was anything in there to reveal it. Do you guys know if Bellator is making money or losing money, whether it's from like earnings, cash flows, whatever? Do you guys know the financial position of Bellator? Does anyone know the financial position of Bellator?
It's not in the 10K as far as I recall from August anyway. So is it in there?
No. I just looked to see what if anything they said, and it was minimal at best. But do we have an idea as to what? In other words, what I mean by that is by what the starting point is.
Yeah.
Right. What qualifies as success kind of depends on where you're at.
Yeah. Well, I mean, from my understanding for people is that Bellator, no matter what, Bellator is not going to make a profit. They Viacom and Spike owns them, so they set their budget based on whatever revenue they get. So if it's a massive success, I mean, that's the very reason they bought a sports property. So that the sports property, if it does successful, you can't outprice them. They can set the price that they want themselves. So, in other words, I don't know.
Well, I do think though with the ratings have done well. I mean, they did surprisingly well with their pay-per-view, even though they had the you know who backed out of who was it, Tito or whoever backed out of the pay-per-view, but like they still did 100,000 pay-per-view buys, which is quite surprising. So they've done well, and the ratings since in the fall have for season 11 have gone up considerably, and this past January's Bellator show did well as well. So what that I guess that can equate to is potential sponsorships down the road, however that may be, and maybe more maybe it makes it more attractive to sponsors of Bellator and sponsors of fighters, since a lot of those that market is going to be fleeing the UFC.
No, that's one thing. I remember when Scott got there, he made a kind of an announcement that they're on the lookout for fighters, basically an open call to free agents, and we haven't seen many free agent fighters. In fact, I can't think of one named free agent fighter that's tested the market since Scott got there and made that announcement. Are you surprised that there's been no free agents coming forward in the last 7 months or so since he got there? And do you expect some to start testing the market?
I think, well, they tried to sign Gilbert last year under Rebney, but I think what that showed Zuffa is basically we gotta shore up our guys that might be on the end of their contract. So even guys that the UFC may say, hey, we don't need this guy, they don't want to give to Bellator, so they'll re-up them for whatever that would seem. But I do foresee in the future some UFC fighters testing the waters and going over to Scott and signing on with Bellator.
Yeah, I absolutely do as well. I mean, all we need to know is that fighters seem to love this guy. I love that guy. And assuming he's changed the contracts from the way they were, maybe to something looking a little bit more like Strikeforce contracts, that the fighters are going to be interested in going there. Maybe not necessarily everybody, but it seems like there's a little bit of leeway to be in this for the long run, right? Viacom's a public company, and public companies are constantly bombarded for numbers. So if they are losing money with Bellator, you can't expect them to be doing that forever. The end game's got to be to turn this thing around. But at the same time, Viacom's got 2-point-something billion in earnings, every year. So Bellator is kind of more of a blip on the radar, I'm sure. So that it seems like Scott Coker should get his chance to go out there and try to do really well with this thing. And I expect them to start getting really aggressive. The thing is, like these fighter contracts, for the big names, there's not a ton of expirations every year, especially if they re-sign before their contract expires. So we've got to get that first big name to switch over. And will it be Phil Davis? Maybe Phil Davis will be the name.
It's a very big name, Phil Davis.
Yeah.
Game changer. But okay, I've got to step up for 1 second here, but I'm going to leave you guys a question while I go just let someone outside. My question is, now do you see Bellator, is Bellator legitimate competition now for the UFC? Or what do you think it will take for them to be legitimate competition for the UFC if you don't think they are? So we'll start with you, Paul, and then Jason. I'll be right back, gentlemen.
Okay.
For me, I like the aspect of going after elite fighters, but also going after some fun things. But I absolutely hated the Kimbo Slice signing. just utterly. I mean, there's got to be a point at which you stop doing things that are ridiculous. Whereas putting on fun fights like Meta Morris with Hinzo and Sakuraba, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't ridiculous. That was fun. I mean, it turned out to be not the most exciting thing in the world, but those types of things I would love to see. And you want to start building that fan base while you try to compete for some of the more elite fighters. I just get concerned with things like Kimbo that they're going a little bit. They might go a little bit too ridiculous. But I don't know. That's just me.
Yeah, a little bit too pro wrestling. I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I think. With the Kimbo Slice signing, you definitely get that sense of spectacle under Scott Coker, as opposed to straight MMA quality. I do think that the UFC is taking notice of what Bellator is doing. Whether or not they will admit that they are concerned is another thing. I definitely think that they have their eye on what Scott is doing. And that also comes into play when they're looking at their roster and seeing who's up on their deals. I definitely think, even though we joke about Phil Davis, he could be used on the Bellator roster, and it'll be interesting to see what Zuffa does with him. Whether or not they decide to re-up his contract or whatnot. So all Bellator needs is a couple known names for people to tune in on Friday nights and check it out, and they can definitely put together some cards that people would be of interest. So I do think that competition is coming, and it'll be good for both sides.
Right, yeah, and I mean, historically, with just all sports leagues, the second this lawsuit, I guess, will try to determine how effective the other competitors are right now, but the second there's sort of a big, major second alternative to athletes, you start seeing, over a few years, you start seeing labor costs rise, and oftentimes they start rising so much that someone goes out of business. But while that's happening, that's a good thing for the athletes. So I agree with you. I definitely expect Bellator to go out there and start to get aggressive the way Scott Coker seemed to be back when he was at Strikeforce. It sounds like I've never heard the Spike Force designation, but I love that.
So do you think that they'll start signing fighters and incorporate them into their cards, into the roster?
Are you talking to John or me?
Paul, since you were there first. John just sat down.
I was listening though. That's a good.
I definitely do, and now the thing is, they might not win, but if they don't win, then you get the sort of Gilbert Melendez effect, where the UFC pays a lot more than they wanted to for Gilbert Melendez. But I definitely expect him to start. I don't know him nearly as well as John, but start expecting him to do what he did in Strikeforce, and then every once in a while you get like Dan Henderson back then and Nick Diaz, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I just don't know. I mean, personally, people forget one thing about Gilbert Melendez, and Gilbert Melendez's situation is kind of unique. Is that he didn't lose any value when he lost his last fight to Benson Henderson. Most people thought he won, so he stayed at that peak value of being at least one of the top two guys at lightweight. And if he had beaten Benson Henderson, he never would have been able to test that market because he would have been the champion and had a champion clause. So there's that. What happened to Strikeforce was after Dan Henderson left, you'd notice no one else went over to Strikeforce. UFC is very good at making sure that competitors do not get, unless they spend a lot of money. But even then, I guess after Arlovsky and them left, they changed their contracts. I know a lot of fighters want to test the market. I guess I'm going to wait and see mode if people actually start testing the market. Especially, I mean, a few will, a tier down or two, but I'm talking about the real top guys that would really be game changers that bring over.
The one thing I'd add though that we kind of don't know as a public is you don't know. I mean, maybe you do, John, because you seem to know everything behind the scenes, but you don't know when. It's one thing to sort of publicly have a contract and then the UFC can match it. It's another thing just to have in the negotiation process another legit alternative that you can at least somewhat threaten to go to. That right there is better than not having it, right? That
Oh
right
yeah.
there is a little bit of leverage. So when even though when we say test the market, right, we might not see somebody sign with Bellator and wait to get it matched, but it doesn't mean that Bellator is not out there trying to sign those fighters and driving up UFC costs.
Oh yeah,
Right?
I think it already happened. I mean, Strikeforce helped a lot. Everybody said it was a huge blow when Strikeforce disappeared, because if you could even, managers would call Joe Silva and say, "Hey, Strikeforce is looking at this fighter," and he'd say, "Okay, we're going to offer you twice what we said before." You know, some guy, entry level guy, and they'd be lying. You know, Strikeforce didn't even know the guy existed. But that's what manager said. It was like, that's the benefit of having at least someone out there that you can threaten, especially when someone like the UFC wants everybody. They don't want, you know, they don't want to risk losing someone outside their net. So you can throw that out there and get, oh yeah, here's an extra 10 grand. We'll match what Strikeforce or Bellator is up to, and you know, you haven't even spoken to them yet.
Yeah. So when I hear those sorts of things, that's what I call testing the water. But we might have different definitions.
Well, I meant testing the water in the sense getting your maximum value, to actually get two promotions bidding for you and get your value up as high as possible.
Yeah.
Which, well, I guess we'll wait and see. It'll be interesting if that happens. Okay, so another thing happened. We'll move on to the next subject, I guess, since I'm doing this one. Is the long-awaited Reebok deal was announced last year, at the end of last year, and the long-awaited uniforms are supposed to make an appearance to the UFC early next year, or not early, mid next year, after July. So if people are unfamiliar with this, what it is that the UFC has made a exclusive sponsorship deal with one sponsor, Reebok, and that all other sponsors are now banned from the cage. So I'll go with you, Jace, I guess first. If you could tell people briefly what the old sponsorship plan was for fighters in the UFC, and what's the new one going to look like with the new Reebok deal and the code of conduct, at least what we know about it.
Okay, well, at least what I know about it, I guess, is the old deal. Back in the old days, you could have any sponsor. This basically, that's how we got Mickey's, Condom Depot, Guns R Us, Ammo to Go, those kinds of sponsors. Whatever fighters could find, they could do. They could do the hey, I'm having an after party after they won the fight and get some money there too. So basically, they had a lot of alternative revenue streams aside from fighting that night. And then a couple years back, the UFC instituted a sponsorship quote-unquote tax or sponsorship fee, how you would gauge it. But basically, it was a scale that the sponsors had to pay for the right to show its brand in the UFC octagon. So that foreclosed for several sponsors who just could not afford that particular tax. And that tax ranged, and it was based upon who you were, I guess, and what kind of sponsors you were doing. There were the dynamic fasteners who did sponsor deals in bulk, and other sponsors of the like who would pay a fee for their fighters to don their brand on the cage, on their shirts and whatnot. And now we come to the uniform deal, which came into effect or was announced last year, and basically it's between UFC and Reebok, making Reebok the official outfitter. And a couple weeks ago, you guys had the official outfitter policy, which basically did away with all sponsors aside from the official sponsors and as well as Reebok. So Reebok controls the cage. There's a specific set of rules in which fighters will get the opportunity to pick what Reebok outfit they'd like, as well as their cornermen. Gone will be the fight banners, unfortunately. We'll miss those. But basically, in addition to the fact that the fighters will have to don Reebok when involved in their fights, as well as promoting their fights, they will be fined or assessed penalties for not properly wearing the brand or wearing another brand or doing something outside of the scope of the new policy that's been instituted. So that's what we're going to start seeing, I believe, in July.
Okay. Now I guess we have no expectations what they're going to make yet. We have no clue what the actual details, the financial details are. I've heard some rumors, but I guess, Paul, you'd written about a uniform deal in spring, if I remember right. Could you
Yeah.
explain to people, I guess, the importance of selling them as the fighters as a block, the UFC as a block, and how that changes the sponsorship market?
So the two main economic issues, and there was one aspect of that which back then I kind of overlooked, which is a little tweak today. But the two main economic issues with sort of selling the fighters as a block is basically like this, right? Say you're Pepsi and you're going to sell your soda to and you go to one store and try to do it, and you negotiate a price, and you go to another store and negotiate a price. Well, if Yum Brands sells off KFC altogether, right, they're going to get a much better price for what they're paying for that. That's essentially the idea. And so when you're on the flip side with the UFC, if you say, hey, you can be the only one with your logo on our fighters, you should get much more out of that sponsor than you would if it was done on an individual basis. And the other element, the other main key element, is that when you do this individual relationship, what you give Reebok, and this would not be seen or felt for a while. It takes time. But what you give is you give Reebok a really strong incentive to want to promote that brand so that they can make money off of it, right? They're the only apparel company out there. Everything UFC that's bought is Reebok. Then they make money off of that, and they're a very strong marketing partner. And if you've got like 10 different, sponsors here and there, you don't get that quite as strong. The aspect that is a little bit different from the traditional is, say you're like a grocery store and you're deciding whether to make, a certain spice or bread exclusive on your rack, right? You get to make that decision between your own options. What's going on here is the fighters are making decisions now, and then sort of the UFC is taking that away from them. So that's the one element that's a little bit different that I didn't note in the thing that I put out back like in May or something like that.
A question I have is, I guess, how are people going to gauge that this is? I know there's a lot of discussion. Step back a little bit. A lot of discussion about, is it good for the fighters? Is it a better deal than it was before? Is it obviously, like you said, a uniform deal? If you sell that, you can make more money in revenue. But coming from forget the fans, I guess, from a fighter point of view, how do they decide? How should they determine that this is a better deal for them, or if this is something that the UFC implemented that really that they're not getting a better deal out of it?
So, and that's the scary thing, because no one knows. None of the fighters really know. And one of the things that I did not indicate as well in the recap to the Reebok deal is that fighters will be paid based upon their particular rank, and also the sales that they make within the retail, whatever retails stores that they, whatever units they sell or whatnot. But the concern is there's nothing that has been out there that states that, well, this is what the 10th ranked fighter will receive under the new Reebok deal. This is what the unranked fighter will receive in the Reebok deal. So it's hard to gauge what you will receive versus what are you getting now. And I think unless that's come out, that's a huge concern. The only thing within the Reebok policy that you could say, okay, well, that's okay, is that it specifically states that you'll be paid within 10 days after the fight, whatever that may be. So it could be a lot of money, it could be less, or it could be less than what you usually get.
Okay, now I've heard rumors what the price is from certain people. I don't know if they're accurate, but they're from pretty good sources. And the prices they give me are in the ballpark of, let's say, from $3,000 to $5,000 for unranked fighters, to around $10,000 to $15,000 for 15 to 11, 20, maybe 15 to 20,000 for the 10 to 5, 25 to 35 for the top 5, and then champs get a lot more. So I guess with those, let's pretend those numbers are accurate. Are those numbers that make sense for the deal for fighters? I guess for a lot of fighters that's an improvement over what they're making. But if you're a featherweight, number 14, that's probably more than you're getting right now. But if you're a Matt Mitrione or a Diego Sanchez, that sounds like, if they don't tier it for veterans or guys with more notoriety, that sounds like you're taking a huge pay cut in what your sponsorship dollars is right now. Paul, I mean, does that sound that way to you, Paul?
Yeah, no, I mean, it kind of, I'm still not 100% sold on this whole thing, but it also depends on your perspective. If your perspective is one where you're wanting to make sure that everyone's happy, I mean, how many times do you think of a corporate policy out there that makes everyone in the company happy? That's just not going to happen, right? To me, the perspective, is this a good thing in general for fighters over the long term, recognizing that some people are going to be made worse off by it? I know we need to know what the fighters are making, and if you say that for a number of them it's more, that tends to be a good thing. But what we actually have seen, though, is that, remember how the question was going to be, is it only the champions who do their own thing, or could other people, like Chael Sonnen, if he were still around, do his own thing? And at least appears that Conor McGregor is getting to do his own thing, right? And I know Joe Lozon was saying he's going to take a big hit, right, based on what he's making. But it appears that we've got the opportunity for people with notoriety who aren't champions to sign their own deals. The question is if Diego Sanchez, Joe Lozon, those types of people will be able to do it. Wow.
That's interesting about the people negotiating. This kind of segues right into, I guess, our next subject, is basically what the UFC did is did a collective bargaining with the fighters. Not with the fighters, but using the fighters to bargain with Reebok. They organized them for their purpose. But they're not a union. And that brings us, and they can't form a union because fighters are independent contractors, but are they? And I guess, Jason, that was your subject. Are they fighters independent contractors, or are they employees? And while you're doing that, I got to go help a client really quick, so I'll be right back. But okay. I'll be listening.
All right, good. So, so it'll segue into our discussion about independent contractors versus employees. And, that is one of the hugest questions that we've had for years, is whether the UFC fighters are independent contractors or employees. Now, the difference, one of the main differences, factors that defines whether or not an individual is an independent contractor versus an employee is whether or not there is a retention of control to do your job. So what is interesting with this Reebok deal is whether or not that particular the particular Reebok deal, the particular Reebok policy falls within the scope of the retention of control. So, Paul, what do you think about the Reebok deal? How it's structured, and does that kind of infringe on the independent contractor role?
It very well could. For those who are listening, if you haven't done it, I'd encourage all of you to go online and look at some resources out there. The one that I look at a lot is from the Department of Labor, called Fact Sheet 13, Am I an Employee? Employment Relationship under the Fair Labor Standards Act. Neither of us are experts in this area, so that's obviously not the only source to look at, but there's actually six key elements, right? Nature and degree of control by the employer is only one of the six. And there's 5 other ones out there, but this deal will, I would imagine, if the fighters ever shift, let's say this antitrust lawsuit goes bad or there's some minimal settlement, right? I would expect the next shift to be, hey, let's try to be deemed employees, and I would think they would have a better chance at that than my own personal opinion about the current antitrust lawsuit. And so that control element is one of them, and this agreement will definitely signal an element of control. The funny thing is there's some other elements in those 5 other ones where things can actually, it appears that they can actually work against the fighter. The fact that sort of they make investments and have the opportunity for profit or loss, depending on how good they are and what they spend, that could actually go against them becoming employees, it looks like. So there are some funny things in there when you read it. Because the focus that we hear in the media is on control, and this definitely enhances the UFC's control, but there are other elements that may be at play I just don't think either of us are experts. Are you an expert, Jason?
No, I'm not that much of an expert, but just to kind of go over just some of the things that the benefits, I guess you could say, of being about an employee versus an independent contractor is that it would subject Zuffa to certain compliance standards as being an employer, some basically federal and state laws. It would also potentially give the fighter as an employee the opportunity for such benefits as pension, insurance. I know they get insurance right now, but other types of, it would require levels of insurance, and things of that nature. Obviously, an interesting thing that I just came up into my mind is if you have women fighters, if they get pregnant, they would have to comply with the federal laws there about the women. I don't know. I think it's FLSA. I don't want to step on my acronyms, but basically you'd have to comply with those types of federal laws. Whereas being an independent contractor, I guess you get the joy of doing your own taxes. There is, being an independent contractor, supposedly a freedom of going from job to job, which if you sign a contract, under the UFC you cannot. But there you go.
Yeah, and the one thing I would add is that it looks like if they do go down this route, it seems like to be effective, it's going to have to be at the federal level. I believe you hear about some of these things happening at the state level. A common example is like with strip clubs and them being independent contractors or employees. And you see different rulings across different states. The problem, if anything happens at the state level, is if you get a bad ruling in one state, the UFC will just say, okay, we're not going to put any shows there. Right? It's like when California was threatening. Remember when California was threatening to change the promoter rules like 2 or 3 years ago? Yeah, and it's like, okay, we just won't go to California. But so it seems like it would have to be at the federal level for this to really be effective.
Yeah, well, right now I got an independent contractor. It looks like he's smuggling drugs behind me, but no, what I find fascinating, and I just got my headphones signal up here. You talk about state level. What's interesting is how the UFC has expanded all these markets who have different labor laws about what's considered an employee and an independent contractor. It'll be interesting if in certain areas, because I know like a lot of Latin American countries and European countries have much stronger labor protections. If they start ruling that, they can organize. These guys are employees. They can form a union because of the UFC's overseas efforts. It'll also be interesting if the UFC is the only one gets. Eventually, if they were found to be employees, and they're the only ones that that have to have a union in MMA because they have so many much stricter guidelines over their fighters.
Most definitely, and I think the one question that we kind of skirted here was, do you think that there is the possibility of legal action to determine whether or not the UFC fighters could be deemed employees?
For me, I think I already said it. I think if this case goes bad, this current lawsuit goes bad, that would be the next area that people explore. That they'll be looking strongly at that. That's just my guess.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if the case goes bad or not, I think sooner or later someone's going to argue it. I mean, it's just there's just too much potential, I think, in that realm to go forward with that. So, but it'll be. I missed one thing. I had I was so distracted. I guess did you guys have an opinion? Do you think they're independent contractors or employers or not?
Oh, go ahead, John. Go ahead.
Me? That's a tough one. The one thing I think, though, is I don't necessarily agree with what you hear people saying out there about, when I hire a plumber or a carpenter that I don't make them wear a uniform, that sort of thing. Because there are independent contractor examples where you either do have a dress code or a uniform, right? I mean, I've been an independent contractor for consulting work, and I can't show up in shorts and flip-flops, right? You guys are independent contractors, are you not? Well, I mean, aren't you kind of, essentially? Yeah. There are restrictions, and I think I definitely don't know the law on this, but my thoughts on it would be the more that you come off as sort of representing your customers who you're working for, the more that it's okay to impose restrictions on things like your appearances, stuff like that. Because spokesmodels have to wear uniforms. There are areas where independent contractors do it. So the fact that what I'm trying to say is the fact that solely because you're imposing a uniform does not mean that this does not mesh with the idea of being an independent contractor. But you've got the control element for you going as well, right? And I honestly don't know. All I know is that the UFC is gonna fight like hell, right? You've got the freaking station casino people that you're messing with station casinos.
Yeah.
And we know what they do when you try to do anything that remotely leads to organization.
Yeah.
I think the uniform policy that they've implemented just bumps up against the line between independent contractor and employee. Definitely they are getting up close to, where it does appear that there is levels where you can be considered, the UFC fighter can be considered an employee. But you could you have to look at the policy in total and kind of go line by line, saying how much of it would you consider it to be an independent contractor versus being an employee. And to me, even though there are other factors involved, I think that level of control is key. I do think, though, like Paul was saying, that dress codes and things like that are acceptable for independent contractors. It's just that so essentially you could state that, hey, this guy, he could go to the ring wearing a UFC style uniform, and that would be, he'd still be considered an independent contractor. That argument I could see that is plausible. So
yeah, and I would just add to that, though, that in addition to just the control, there are other things at play here, and they sort of go back and forth in what you think about independent contractor status, like the extent to which the work performed is integral to the employee's business, to the employer's business. That totally goes towards these guys being employees, right? The permanency of their work relationship seem pretty permanent, but that depends on their contracts, right? But the worker's skill, the more skilled the workers are, the more it goes towards being an independent contractor and not an employee. So there are all these other elements that can go back and forth. The worker's own opportunity for profit and loss, right? With your training camps and stuff like that. It's not as clear-cut around control, and there are some things that seem to support employee and some things that seem to support independent contractor status, when I look at it, at least.
I mean, personally, I have no clue. I'm going to be honest, I have no clue. I'm not a labor law expert. All I know is that the one thing I will say, that if anybody in the fight business is an employee, the UFC fighters are probably the closest. So I'm just that's the only thing I know of. If you're going to make an argument that any fighter is an employee, the one that you're going to argue is probably the UFC fighters. They're the closest with all the degree of control, the contracts, the restrictions, and the uniform, all those things. They're the closest. They might not be, but they got to be the closest to them.
Come on, King of the Cage, come on.
King Cage owns everything you do permanently. Wow.
All right, guys. So with that, we're gonna wrap it up, and we're gonna save our discussion of our thoughts about pay-per-view and UFC business, and maybe a little. Or would you have that thrown in there?
Drug testing? Did you say drug testing?
Oh no, I was talking about John and his UFC finances.
That's probably 2 weeks away. That could be the next week after that.
2 weeks away? Oh yeah, that'll be a good time to do another one.
Yeah.
So we're gonna save that, maybe a little on drug testing for later. If I forgot to mention it in the beginning, the tentative name we have is Show Money, and so we want your thoughts. If you're watching this and you like that name, let us know. If you have anything better, we are totally open to it. So leave comments at MMA Payout or at Bloody Elbow, or email any of us, and you can follow Jason at, I have no idea how to say what in the world your Twitter handle is.
Dilletaunt, Dilletaunt. You can also follow MMA Payout at MMA Payout.
He makes it so complicated.
Yeah. That's why no one follows me. That's why I only have like 200 followers.
and John is Mr. Hey Not the Face at Twitter, and you can catch him at Bloody Elbow, and you can check me out at MMA Analytics on Twitter and also on Bloody Elbow. And we will catch you next time when something big comes up, which we think will be in maybe 2 weeks or so, and we'll catch up with some of this other stuff.